hi there! Yeah, it's me! You'd be surprised, aren't you? I kinda am. I went away for a year. And you wanna know why? I'm a complete fucking idiot. Oh my god, I got lazy and stupid, people. That's all I can say for myself. I saw movies. I saw The Amazing Spider-Man, Dark Knight Rises. I've read books. I've played games. I've done a lot of things I should have been on top of, and I had been prepared for, but I didn't get around to do it. You know, and I let a year slip by, and, you know, a lot of other shit that I just really don't feel like going into, and you don't want to hear about anyway. And that's, you know, that's just where I am. I was just... But I am back, and I have seen something. Iron Man 3. You know, to start off, I want to go ahead and, you know, talk about one thing in particular, and it'll probably take up a good part of the time, and it's going to be loaded with spoilers. This is going to give away a major plot point. Sorry for those that, you know, wanted to get as little of that as possible, but I wanted to comment on one major aspect of the film, and that was, of course, the Mandarin himself, the main villain, or supposedly the main villain. Here he's portrayed by Ben Kingsley, an Englishman, which really should get some people's attention right off the bat. You know, if you're familiar with the comics, then you're aware that he is actually, in fact, Asian, which, you know, of course, Mandarin is a Chinese name. Or at least a verb, or, you know, noun, whatever. It's a title. And in this case, you know, to understand what I'm saying here, you have to understand that, you know, aside from this, you know, the fact that he is whiteface, effectively, you have, you know, a white person portraying an Asian character. I mean, we had this before with Batman Begins. We had Liam Neeson playing Ra's al Ghul, an Arab. We had, in Dark Knight Rises, we had Tom Hardy portraying Bane, a Latin American man. Which, I had to admit, that was a bit of a heartbreaker. If I really wanted to pick anybody for that role, it would have been Danny Trejo, somebody like that, who, you know, just, I'm astounded by. Although, I wound up liking it anyway, because the performance was solid. Now, in the case of the Mandarin, for people who are familiar with the comics, they wanted the Mandarin to be what he was in the comics, you know, a very severe, serious threat to Iron Man and, you know, nations at large, because, of course, his main goal is world domination. Here, it's different, and, frankly, I think it's brilliantly done within the confines of the film, and it's actually a very good deconstruction. You have to understand that, you know, the Mandarin, when he was created, was, as I said, he was Asian. In the wake of the communist takeover in China, the growing Vietnam War, and things like this, you had basically the Yellow Peril going on. The Yellow Peril refers to any time that, you know, Asians were used in a sinister role simply for the fact of, well, portraying them as evil. Such as, you know, and this was common from the time of the 1840s and the gold rush of, you know, Chinese arriving on the shores, you know, to get involved on the gold rush, to years later, up until, like I said, the Communist Revolution, and at least well into the 1970s and 80s. You know, until, of course, cultural backlash, and, you know, Asian Americans, you know, stepped in and had something to say about it. Now, if you wanted to argue in favor of having, you know, the Mandarin be Chinese, well, how Chinese do you want to go? I mean, like, you could go back to his roots, to the, you know, the Yellow Peril itself, and have fucking Fu Manchu. You know, you can't argue in favor of it too strongly, and, you know, this is where we can get off of the racism issue of having, you know, Fu Manchu do his thing versus the actual plot of the film. And to understand that, I also have to point out the fact that the actual main threat is the Advanced Idea Mechanics, or AIM for short. And, you know, AIM isn't portrayed as they are in the comics. I mean, you know, there's not MODOK, a giant floating fucking head with, you know, plans for world domination. And, you know, there's not an army of jagoffs running around in yellow jumpsuits, you know, also plotting world domination. I mean, it's not about that. It's about the fact that in the film, the Mandarin is actually a manufactured threat. He's a, well, he's a brand name. He's something to put in front of a camera for AIM, so as to use, the idea of the foreigner, to scare the United States. And that's the main thing, is, as they say, they want to control the supply and demand of the war on terror. They want to control the White House, and they want to, of course, have their terrorists stand out in front of the camera and do his thing. And, frankly, I love Ben Kingsley's performance as the Mandarin, or Trevor, as he turns out to be. It's so masterfully done as a deconstruction of Yellow Peril, as a deconstruction of, even maybe picking the fact that he is a white man doing an Asian role. It can work on so many levels, and it's quite well done to the fact that he's completely manufactured. There's, it's all AIM, and their technology, and everything else. And I can't express, again, my admiration at the end for what they did. There are going to be people who whine and bitch and moan and groan about the fact, well, the Mandarin should be this, the Mandarin should be that, and blah, 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 blah. So what? On the larger scale, you have to understand that, this film isn't going to be just in the United States, where, of course, it's aired first in, parts of Europe and blah, 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 and so forth. And it's not going to be just for the West. It is going to go out to the global market, and, of course, when it hits China, do you think the Chinese government's going to be fond of the idea of portraying Asians evilly? I mean, that's a very strong sticking point. You go ahead and throw that in their lap, and they will tear you apart. And that's what I'm saying. You can't hold on to your previously preconceived notions. This is why deconstructing the Yellow Peril, deconstructing the War on Terror, this is brilliantly done. And the fact that you made the Mandarin a product rather than a direct character in the film, it's very well done, especially for the superhero genre in film, which most people don't take too seriously anyway. And yes, I am aware of that too. I mean, you have, in comic book fiction, you have to have a much bigger suspension of disbelief than you would in most other fiction. And, that's where we come full circle and we can talk about the film directly. The film's main focus, I think, is more about the story arc of Tony Stark himself and his technology, dealing with, as he says at the start of the film, his own personal demons. And, we pick up those months after the events of the Avengers. He constantly refers back to New York, which he does not talk about. It may seem a little off to some people that, at the end of that film he seemed rather happy-go-lucky, and then at the end of, or at the start of this film, he's basically confronted with post-traumatic stress disorder, which it's well done. I'm not going to go ahead and compare it and start saying that, people with actual post-traumatic stress disorder, cops, firemen, soldiers, and so forth and so on, that, this speaks to them. I'm not that pretentious. But it does play on the fact that, with such as, terrorist attacks of the war on terror and so forth and so on, the having to deal with post-traumatic stress disorder is something that, it speaks to the public. At least raises awareness. And again, that's fairly good for the superhero genre. It's certainly higher up than what most people would consider the low-hanging fruit of just, sticking a man in a metal suit and having him run around and blow shit up. It's more than that. And it's very well done in that regard. And it also helps complete Tony Stark in the sense that I've talked about, I think in the Avengers review, saying that I didn't really like Tony in his previous two films. This is the film, I think, that fully matures him. As he remarks himself, the suit was a cocoon and he blossoms forth into well, a guy that you can really like. His humor it's laced more with real world experience. It's laced with, the stress and strain of his job, what he's done, what he's dealt with, and this latest threat. And it's I don't know, in so many ways I would go ahead and say that I could consider the Iron Man films complete. We could go on, this would be where I would compare it to The Dark Knight Rises, which completed its trilogy of the Dark Knight series from Christopher Nolan and Warner Brothers. And that's good. That film, I felt there was no way you could top the series any further. That was as far as you could go for what had been done. With this, seeing as how it's roped into a much larger continuity with other films, it can either stop as is and be done with the Iron Man story as we know it, or it can branch off into something else, or it can continue into more films. Or, more importantly, it could also continue into the larger aspects of the Marvel continuity in film as is. Now, I've made the comparison to The Dark Knight Rises, and, of course, there's many reasons to compare that to this film. You had the fact that both Batman and, Iron Man are both really wealthy dudes that have the time and money to go ahead and pour into being a superhero. It's not, something that everybody can do. To that end, the other comparisons would be the fact that, you have Ra's al Ghul and the Mandarin, who are both influenced by Fu Manchu, again. You have in Dark Knight Rises the fact that Batman has crumbled farther down in the same way that Iron Man himself has crumbled down in this film. They're knocked off their high horses in terms of being experienced, capable superheroes, and they're having to deal with more human issues. Weakness, frailty, overcoming larger odds and obstacles. And, I don't know, I can go ahead and gush on this film so much for what it does, especially in regards to another film that featured a similar plot device. In this film, if you know what I'm talking about from having read the comics, I'm going to spoil that for you, as I'm talking about the extremist technology. I'm not going to go into bigger details. If you don't know what I'm talking about when I say extremists, then you need to either Google it or go watch this movie. That's a big subtle nudge, nudge, wink, wink, hint, hint on you. And I'm going to leave it at that. I'm going to compare it now to G.I. Joe: The Rise of Cobra, which had one of the most annoying fucking plot devices I'd ever seen, was the nanites. The nanites in that film could do anything. It could make super soldiers, shapeshifters, destroy buildings. It was unstoppable in so many ways, and it annoyed me. It was too all-purpose, too easy to throw around and do anything with. Whereas the extremist technology has in this film a very limited, practical, and grounded approach. It makes super soldiers, and that's it. And it's done so well. You have reasons for wanting this technology. It has the capability to fail, and we see it fail spectacularly in some instances. And it's perfectly done. And the reason I say it's perfectly done is I have to compare it to, like I said, the nanological devices in G.I. Joe: Rise of Cobra. And Rise of Cobra, it fucking sucked, okay? That movie was awful for so many reasons, not least of all the, frickin', does anything applied phlebotomy known as the nanites there, versus the extremist technology, which, again, it's succinct and does one thing. It doesn't have super-duper multiple applications all over the place. Beyond that, I don't want to get too much into the plot. I can go ahead and say that the main reasons that the film is good is the comedy is good, the plot points and references and so forth and so on to larger events within the Marvel movie universe are here. They mean something. They can be referenced at will, and if you've been following the film so far, you're in the zone. And if not, then you're intrigued and compelled to go see the other films and do some catch up and research. In that regard, I go ahead and say that, just as I had said in the Avengers review that I did, that Marvel has figured it out. This film, I think, has crystallized all the lessons they've learned from the previous Iron Man films, the previous teething problems they had with the first Hulk film and then the reboot sequel, The Incredible Hulk, and then the perfection of it in Thor, Captain America, and the Avengers. I can go ahead and safely say that Marvel has pretty much won the box office. You know, I'm a DC man myself, but I have to go ahead and admit that DC has really let the ball drop. After the Batman films have been completed, well, we're pretty much spinning our wheels. The Green Lantern film, if you'd seen my review there, it was well thought out but horrendously executed. And there were just so many things wrong there that, you know, I don't expect any more of those films to be made. And if they are, then they need to do a serious, you know, sequel reboot at just as much as The Incredible Hulk wound up doing. I mean, there's nothing here that can't be said about Marvel that shouldn't, you know, be... DC should be taking notes. In so many ways, I felt that the Iron Man series was taking notes off the Batman franchise, and as such, it spread across the Marvel movie universe, you know, inflicting the kind of gritty realism that, you know, has made the Nolan films on Batman so good. Well, you know, this is where, for Marvel, they should be teaching DC, or at least DC should be paying attention. You know, they're letting their own lessons slip away from them. You know, the only other film they have on the radar that's certainly in, you know, production and getting ready to be released will be later this summer when we have the Superman film The Man of Steel, which, by the way, of course, is being produced by Christopher Nolan and was assisted on by David S. Goyer, who wrote for the Batman films that Nolan did. You know, again, you know, as a DC guy, I hate to admit this, but trust me, I love this. This was a very well done film, and it certainly has won me over to Tony Stark, and I hope that Robert Downey Jr. continues in the role. I think he's really come to inhabit it and done a very good job making it his own. I want to see more of this, and I'm definitely psyched up to go ahead and continue on to the rest of the series, going into Thor, the Captain America film, Ant-Man, and cross my fingers, I'm hoping that Guardians of the Galaxy will be good, because I like the Guardians of the Galaxy a lot. And, of course, eventually we'll tie back into a second Avengers film. You know, and, of course, we've also had... that's the sad thing about it. Poor Spider-Man. What with the reboot for his films, we're kind of, you know, we forget about him. But, you know, there are talks that he may show up somewhere along the lines in later films. You know, there's definitely plenty of sequel bait in his film. Well, what can I say at the end? But, other than that the film is really good, there are some minor flaws here and there, so I can't go ahead and give it a perfect score, but it certainly does a lot better than the previous two films of Iron Man that I was iffy about, but this, you know, has definitely won me over. I can go ahead and say that I would go ahead and give this film 4 out of 5. This, you know, it's not necessarily perfect, but damn it, this is the quintessential superhero film that a lot of people should be, you know, getting fired up for. And, you know, it's definitely something to whet our appetite for later on in the Marvel movie box office. Well, other than that, I can go ahead and only close on that kind of good note. But at the same time, I go ahead and can point out the fact that I will be back fairly soonish. And I'm going to confront an old problem that I thought I had gotten rid of when I was, you know, reviewing The Woman in Black. I had made the promise, or had made the statement that I was done with it, but you can't escape your past. Fucking hell. I'll see you again in future. This is C.S. Bernard for Geeky News, signing off.